Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Dr. Debra Soh Podcast. Joining me this week is Dr. Susan Bradley. Susan is a professor emerita in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto and the former psychiatrist-in-chief at the Hospital for Sick Children. If you enjoyed the podcast, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. Thank you to everyone who has already done this. Your reviews always make my day. You can also support the show on Patreon and follow me on social media at Dr. Debra Soh. As many of you know, I was on the Doctor's TV show earlier this week. If you haven't seen it yet, you can go to drdebrasoh.com, click on the Appearances tab, and watch the full episode there. Watching children being indoctrinated into the grades K through 12 gender cult can make a person want to tear their hair out. That's why I started taking AG1. With one delicious scoop of AG1, you're absorbing 75 high-quality vitamins, minerals, whole food-sourced superfoods, probiotics, and adaptogens to help you start your day well. This special blend supports your gut health, your nervous system, your immune system, your energy, recovery, focus, and aging. I like to take AG1 mixed with cold water. It makes me feel very healthy and has this mild tropical taste. You can mix yours with juice, milk, a smoothie, or whatever you're into. AG1 costs less than $3 a day and is lifestyle friendly, whether you eat keto, paleo, vegan, dairy-free, or gluten-free. AG1 also supports mental clarity and alertness so that I can be high energy for the next book burning. Right now, it's time to reclaim your health and arm your immune system with convenient daily nutrition. It's just one scoop in a cup of water every day. That's it. No need for a million different pills and supplements to look out for your health. To make it easy, Athletic Greens is going to give you a free 1-year supply of immune-supporting vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. All you have to do is visit athleticgreens.com/soh. Again, that is athleticgreens.com/soh, spelled SOH, as in my last name, to take ownership over your health and pick up the ultimate daily nutritional insurance. All right. Well, hi, Susan. Thank you so much for coming on my podcast. It's so great to be reunited with you after 4 years. I can't believe it's actually been that long since I last interviewed you.
It's very good to see you again.
Thank you. I love the conversation that we had last time. I know it helped a lot of people. So in this interview, in that interview, actually, for listeners, we talked about rapid onset gender dysphoria and its relationship to autism, borderline personality disorder, and also what parents and young people should know before deciding to transition. So for people listening, as a refresher, rapid onset gender dysphoria, or ROGD, is characterized by the desire to transition to the opposite sex or a third gender, often out of the blue with no previous history of gender atypical behavior or gender dysphoria in childhood. And this is a phenomenon that has been predominantly documented in adolescent girls and young women. Since my book, The End of Gender, has come out, I've continued to get a ton of questions from parents as well as educators working with children and teens presenting with ROGD. And I think this subject has only become more dire since we last spoke. So I wanted this episode to touch on new developments since that interview and also the growing number of young men who are being affected by this ideology. So you recently published a paper in the academic journal Women about how high-functioning autism plays a role in understanding young women's mental health. So I'll link to that paper in the show notes. Autism is characterized by difficulties in social communication and interaction, obsessional interests, rigidity, and adherence to routine. So I want to ask you, Susan, how does autism present differently in girls than boys? And how does high-functioning autism play a role in gender dysphoria?
That's a really important question, Deborah, because what we've observed over the last 10 or 20 years that I've been still connected with seeing kids is that oftentimes we fail to diagnose girls as early as we do boys because their social awareness and ability to fit in is better than that of boys. And boys often can pass because of their interest in things like sports and other things like that. But the girls they are equally sensitive and have equal difficulty in terms of feeling that they actually fit in. But boys may have more avenues. And especially as you get into the teenage years, where the girls have so many issues around peers and what peers are doing and thinking and saying, many of these girls begin to feel very different. They just they know there's something different about them. They don't understand what it is, and that makes them very, very anxious. Most of the girls have felt that they didn't fit in even during the latency. Oftentimes parents will say, well, they didn't really have a close friend. And these are the kinds of things that would have protected them to some extent. But and then once they get into the teenage years, there's so much gathering in groups, and groups both including and excluding others, that it's very easy for them not to know what to do at that point. So that the boys, we often can see the boys earlier on, and they may get a diagnosis at that point. But those boys who fall under the radar are doing so often because they're very bright, often because they have got interests that allow them to connect with other boys. And so those things safeguard them as they're going through the teenage years. So there are significant differences in terms of when these things happen. And girls are much more into, I think, the social networking that's going on the internet. So they're more vulnerable to getting caught up in that. And so, their recourse to trying to figure all of this out is often to be online, trying to figure out other things. Boys are simply less likely to think about themselves as weird or different and try to find out an answer, whereas girls are more likely to do that. So,
And so that's why we see this trend of them being drawn into these online cultures in an attempt to understand themselves and find connection and meaning.
That's absolutely right. And the way the online cultures have been working is that they are so accepting of anyone who says, I think I may be trans. Their response is, you must be trans. There's no question in there about maybe you're not. And they then feel that they're accepted, and being accepted is so important to teens. And so this kind of climate that emerges, I think, makes it much harder for girls to avoid getting caught into the Rogid pattern, which I have liked to almost a cult, and because it has cult-like rules. If you want to talk about it, you don't tell anybody.
Yeah.
And anybody who tells you you're wrong, they're wrong. And there's no question. Yeah. So
would you say that girls on average also crave that social acceptance more than boys who are on the spectrum? Because I imagine if they are then getting this acceptance from whoever it is on the internet, or even in the classroom with their peers, once they do come out as transgender or say that they're non-binary or whatever, that would be even more reinforcing for them.
I think that's right. I think that's the thing that allows them to say, I've found a solution. And you mentioned in your introduction that some of the traits of individuals with autism are cognitive rigidity. And one of the things about high functioning kids with autism is that once they think they're right about something, they have great difficulty letting go of that. So all of these factors play into accepting the fact that, I must be trans.
Right.
And it makes it much harder for parents or other people to say, well, that's kind of unusual that you all of a sudden change like that or anything like that. They're not open to hearing somebody else's opinion if they think that this is an adequate solution. So it makes it hard. It makes it hard for everyone, for parents and therapists often, to help them.
You write in the paper, quote, because these young women are high functioning, their autism spectrum disorder may not be apparent until they're older. They clearly suffer from high levels of anxiety and depression, but also from eating disorders and body dysphoria, end quote.
Yeah.
Why does autism tend to overlap with eating disorders and body dysphoria in girls? Because I think this is particularly relevant with regard to gender and transitioning, because many detransitioners will say they struggled with eating disorders and body issues, and that's what led them to want to transition.
Well, and again, it gets back to trying to figure out what it is about them that's so different. They know there's something that's different, and they don't know what it is, and they begin to connect that with, it must be my body. They're trying to find an answer to why they have not been accepted by their peers. And, that's a very tough kind of road to hoe for most of these kids. So they, once they feel, that this makes sense to them in some kind of way, it's hard to let go of it. But the eating disorder thing is a similar kind of thing. It's a focus on their body as being a problem or something wrong with it. And if I only got slimmer and more beautiful, I'd be more acceptable. And the body it's a body dysmorphia that I was referring to, and there's something wrong with my body. So they'll come in with, there really is something wrong with my nose, maybe, or it's the way I'm built, and wanting solutions that are concrete, as opposed to, why am I feeling this way? And others, parents, everybody would look at them and say, there's nothing wrong with your nose,
right,
and there's nothing wrong with your body, and you don't need to lose weight. But they feel as though this is a kind of answer. And the other part of all of that is there's a lot of anxiety, depression, and suicidal thinking that we see in these kids regularly. So, but it's not quite like the anxiety and depression that we may see in kids who are not in the autism spectrum. And in that, I mean that it comes and goes. And so kids will suffer an offense or some sort of insult and be very hurt by it and become quite suicidal really quite quickly. And I've followed a number of these kids where we would end up having to have them in the ER. They'd be in there for a day or two, and then they'd be out. So it wasn't that kind of intense background depression or suicidal. It's often just reactive to something that's happened, and it'll go away. And part of what we're getting back to is that, in my view, and I have this hang up about emotion regulation, they have a fundamental difficulty that you can see in these kids when they're younger. Often they have a lot of meltdowns. Their parents, the parents will often say that it was very hard for them if something happened that they didn't understand, and they could get really discombobulated quickly over quite minor kinds of things. And this is fundamentally dysregulation, that they have more difficulty than a typically growing youngster would have in learning to regulate these things. So once they get hyper aroused, they can't calm themselves back down very easily.
right.
And that contributes a lot to a sense of, there's something wrong with me, I've got to do something. But I can't find out what I've got to do is how it feels to them. And this accounts, in my mind, for the depression, the suicidal things, and the anxiety. And some of them will engage in cutting, as a way of trying to get control over what's happening. They will often express the feeling that once they've cut themselves, they feel soothed.
Yeah.
And so these strategies, which we all recognize as not the best for any of us, are easier for them to get into than they might be for another youngster who doesn't have the same difficulty with regulating themselves.
And you mentioned in the paper, so because some of these signs that you're mentioning or symptoms that you're mentioning do sound a bit like borderline personality disorder, but in the paper you say that if autism is believed to be the underlying cause, then that's the diagnosis that should be treated.
That's right. And, for years, I used the term borderline personality disorder for a lot of these kids, even when they were young, even though you're not supposed to
Hmm.
apply that diagnosis under age 18. But recently, there have been others who have said, we're probably mistaken in terms of making a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. Most of these kids are probably high functioning autism spectrum. And I believe that. I really believe that. I have seen a couple of papers where they've done some brain studies, and the borderline personality kids are coming out looking the same.
Hmm.
And Steve Porges' thing on the vagal nerve stuff,
Right.
that they're showing the same kinds of difficulties. But we have our nomenclature, and
Hmm.
we use these terms because we think it's meaningful. But then when we start realizing that there are a bunch of people that we may not have fully understood who are coming along, and probably if you don't understand where they've come from developmentally, you're going to think of this as, well, this person is a young adult, and this is the diagnosis, borderline personality disorder. But if you actually go back and take a good history, and parents can give you that history if you ask the right questions,
Hmm.
then you begin to understand that this has long-standing roots, and this child has really had a hard time for a number of years, but is like the high-functioning kids tend to be quite bright, all of them, the boys and the girls, and they have found ways of kind of avoiding getting too out of sync with everything.
Right.
But it's a struggle.
Hmm.
So they don't have an easy life. As
Yeah.
teens, they have a very difficult time.
What percentage do you think of kids are being misdiagnosed or mislabeled as BPD instead of autism?
Well, I think it depends a great deal on the orientation of the person who is doing the assessment.
Hmm.
If it's a child psychiatrist or psychologist who takes a real history, most of those should be picking it up. But I found even with the population that I was seeing, that a lot of my colleagues were uncomfortable making the diagnosis of high functioning autism.
Hmm.
And so these are some of the factors that are going on. They may see some of these things and they may say, well, they're just an odd duck, but that isn't helpful to the child. And so and I think there's some people feel that there's it's labeling them as something awful,
Hmm.
but labels can be useful or not useful. And in this case, I think it's really important to get the right label
Yeah.
and to understand the child's development. I would say that probably, it's probably changing now in terms of a percentage. And I can't, do anything more than do a guess, but I would guess that maybe 50% of them were not properly diagnosed
Wow.
or were borderline personality disorder. So.
Huh. And even in the context with body dysmorphia, what you were saying about if it's someone's nose or just a particular body part that someone's fixated on, that's not about gender dysphoria, but that's being now somehow interpreted even by the individual who understandably may not know that just because you're unhappy with your body, it doesn't mean it's necessarily even about your sex or the fact that you're female, say.
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah. I mean, unhappiness with body in this condition is a part of the symptom,
Mm-hmm.
and it isn't very meaningful. And but that's the problem, and the way the affirmative approach has assumed that anybody who makes that comment that they think they are must be. And you know from your work, there's no biological explanation for that. And they continue to believe that they must have something biological that's causing them to feel that way. But none of us have yet to find something like that. So, I mean, as a psychiatrist, I'm always thinking of how you explain things psychologically.
Mm-hmm. And to just find the most honest, realistic explanation instead of worrying about who's going to be upset by what you find. Can you
That's right.
elaborate a bit on the role of the vagus nerve and vagal nerve dysfunction?
Yep. Um, this is a theory that has been formulated by Stephen Porges, who's a psychologist who's really done a lot of work in this area for many years. And what he theorizes with evidence is that some individuals do not have their autonomic system working as well as it should. And the autonomic system comprises two components. There's an alerting component that allows us to know if there's some danger. And then there's another component on top of that, which comes into play to calm us down and help us feel I'm okay. Mm-hmm. And those two, there's a parasympathetic, which is the calming part, and a sympathetic, which is the activating part. And he's actually been able to measure vagal nerve tone. And when you measure what is called vagal nerve tone, you can see that individuals who are in the autism spectrum have poorer vagal nerve tone. That is, that their parasympathetic system, the calming part, is not working to help them calm down. And so they end up, when they've been frightened or something has aggravated them or made them angry, they end up unable to get back to square one. And that means that they're wearing out their system a little bit. And you can actually see this in terms of the brain function going on around all of this. Steve did studies on kids who are in the autism spectrum. He did it in borderline personality disorder and in individuals who'd had what we call early adverse experiences. So kids where there'd been a divorce or a loss of a parent or trauma early on. We know that these kids are more vulnerable in a lot of ways. And all these groups that he's done it in all show poorer than normal vagal nerve tone. So their ability to calm themselves down again is less than adequate. And so when I talk about how once they get dysregulated, they really are feeling horrible. I mean, they don't know what else to do. And what he is looking at is there any way of changing that? We've tried lots of different medications. Our medications are partially good, but there's always side effects with their medications. And so, you can take an anti-anxiety thing, but then you may have side effects from that. And the antipsychotics, which can also calm you down, have horrible side effects at times. So he's been really in the forefront of trying other things. And there was a very famous study done maybe 10 years ago now with people who are termed depression failures or resistant to treatment. They've had at least 2 or 3 failed trials of medication for their depression. And they had an indwelling vagal nerve stimulator. They had to open the skin and put it in the chest to stimulate the vagal nerve. These people, way more than 50% of them, actually were cured. And that's a radical change for any treatment. That hasn't had a lot of press. And I think it's because there's a lot of other forms of stimulation, brain stimulation, which are more direct. So it hasn't taken off. And we don't yet know whether we've got an adequate device that we can use, that it doesn't require something that you have to put under your skin, like a pacemaker. So, but that to me opens up a whole realm of possibilities. If we could find ways of helping these kids learn to self-regulate so they could be calm and think about what they're doing, as opposed to getting locked into solutions that may not be good for them at all.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it speaks to the underlying root cause And also, I think possibilities for treatment, which is really
Yeah.
exciting. Hopefully, that area of research can be done without interference from activism. Hopefully, that's one area that they will have the sense to leave alone, but who knows? I find it's, for some reason, considered taboo to even talk about autism in the context of gender dysphoria, or even to talk about treating autism, because I think there's this sentiment that if you're trying to encourage treatment, that's endorsing stigma or whatever, which obviously I don't agree with. And I just wish I would just wish that researchers could just do their job and not be affected. I want to ask you about the subject of boys with rapid onset gender dysphoria. So for listeners, as a recap, we don't know as much about boys affected by ROGD as we know about girls, because ROGD has been much more prevalent in girls. And to understand male to female transition, our friend Ray Blanchard discovered a two-pronged typology. So male to female transgender people who are sexually interested in men are considered the gay subtype, and then male to female transgender people who are sexually interested in women or both sexes are considered the autogynephilic subtype. So autogynephilia is a paraphilia. Paraphilias were one of my areas of expertise when I was in academia, and autogynephilia is characterized by sexual arousal at the thought of becoming a woman. So my sense is some of the boys who are presenting with ROGD don't appear to fit into either of these subtypes, in that they are attracted to women, but they don't have gender dysphoria. And the parents of these boys also don't believe that their sons are autogynephilic. So they believe their boys represent a third subtype. The parents describe their sons as being extremely bright. They don't tend to really fit in at school. They don't think their sons are sexually active, because in some cases the boys will say they are asexual. In other cases, the sons will say that they're bisexual. And they spend a lot of time online. And there's often a large emphasis for the boys on wanting to wear women's clothing. So sometimes the parents will help them purchase female garments. So I'm basically giving you a somewhat of a broad case study here. But do you think this is evidence of a third subtype? I have my thoughts on this, as you know, but I want to hear what you think first.
Well, the boys that we saw when our gender clinic was still open, the teenage boys,
Mm-hmm.
there was a large population who were transvestic fetishist, which is the paraphilia that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And often there was these kids, when I went back and looked at some of the ways we talked about them, I decided I'd missed the diagnosis, and a lot of those boys were in the autism spectrum, but again, high functioning.
Mm-hmm.
And that they, as I've described, for the girls as well, had difficulty with self-regulation, with their self-esteem as they were coming into adolescence. And as they began to understand sexuality generally, and began to find out, how they could masturbate or what turned them on, they often found that women's underwear was something that they could use. Well, for some of those kids, that translated from not just the underwear, but to full-blown dress and clothing.
Mm-hmm.
And we could see the pattern sort of starting with one thing that might be deemed to be something that would connect them with females in a way that they could tolerate, and that was arousing to them. And, masturbation is self-soothing as well. So the combination of getting into masturbating and finding something that helps them become something pleasurable.
Mm-hmm.
They're not wanting to give that up necessarily. So the dilemma is that those boys initially, when they're seen in early adolescence, generally, in our experience, did not report they wanted to be the other sex. If you pinned them down, generally they would say they like girls.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened, though, because I know in Ray Blanchard's sample, a lot of those individuals kept up, and the cross-dressing became more elaborate. And I could see, if they started out with something like underwear and things like that they would try on other things, and it would gradually escalate to full-blown dress up. And a lot of them, even though they were still using that as their primary way of becoming aroused, they were still married. A lot of these men, before they decided to transition, were married, had children, and but they got into this pattern that they couldn't get out of. Like it had become a part of them, if I can use it that way.
Right.
And that was why I think they pursued the transition. When we were dealing with them, we tried to help them understand what they were feeling and why they were using that, and sort of, if you keep doing this, this is likely going to go in that direction. The other thing is that in that population of kids, when I went back and looked at what we had seen, there was a lot of conflict in the family. And these boys felt they could not stand up to their mothers. The mothers were often, even if the fathers described it this way, as pretty powerful people. And both the father and the boy didn't know when they got angry how to deal with mom, because she would get angry back. And so a lot of the work that we tried to do with them when they were younger was to try to help the family understand what was going on and see what they could do to find other ways of dealing with his anxiety and dealing with his anger, because it was the expression of his anger that caused him the most anxiety. And we know with people who have anxiety disorders, they often really stress out when they get angry, because they don't want to hurt people, and they're afraid that their anger is going to drive people away. So, I mean, it's a complicated dynamic, but there was so much similar stuff in those boys that we kept on seeing all over and over again, that we could see how it could progress, and we could see that if we could do some things early on, that might prevent it. Unfortunately, we don't have a follow-up of those kids to say, and a lot of the families had trouble staying in treatment. And I have to say that my experience with working with really good therapists who are dealing with kids and adolescents in the autism spectrum is that it is quite hard to get them to engage in treatment. And the normal form of treatment is CBT. These therapists I was working with were quite experienced.
And just for people listening, that's cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yeah. And they would come away saying, well, they like to come and talk, but they don't seem to get what I'm trying to get them to understand and do in terms of understanding their thoughts and their feelings and how that creates actions and so on, which is all the basis of CBT. And so the kinds of ways we've had of trying to help these kids are not entirely helpful, I think, or at least aren't working that well. And Jonathan Weiss at York has started to look at something more specific for kids in the autism spectrum. I don't know how much work he's done on it, but I know he's working on modifying CBT so that it might be more useful for kids in the spectrum, which really could offer us something helpful.
That's interesting. So going back to your point about how it becomes in some ways a self-reinforcing thing, that if a child is anxious and they want to self-soothe, so they will sexually cross-dress, masturbate, they will be comforted by that, ejaculation, orgasm. And then the next time they feel anxious, it becomes the same thing. So if, say, hypothetically, the child were to learn better ways of coping or different ways of coping with their anxiety, maybe assertiveness skills to deal with a family or parental dynamic that is not as healthy, then potentially would they, because I know that cross-dressing is not necessarily associated with gender dysphoria, and autogynephilia is also not necessarily associated with gender dysphoria. So if they learn these different skills, would that take them on a different route in terms of not having transvestic fetishism? Because my thoughts are paraphilias are biologically based. There is some social influence in terms of what it is people find sexually interesting in terms of the target. But I'm wondering how an intervention might change the ultimate outcome? Or is it that they would still continue cross-dressing, but maybe it wouldn't be such a huge focus in their life?
Well, we don't know the answer to that, but I would say logically, if they are able to find a way of soothing themselves that's effective, uh, they would not necessarily need to keep doing that. And there's a part of them sometimes that knows that they'd rather not do this, but once they get into this and it works, it's very hard to give things up. I mean, you know about paraphilias, and a lot of the treatments of shaming and all of this stuff have been very difficult, but and coercive and all of the nasty things that we don't want to do. But I think finding strategies for emotion regulation in this group is really critical.
Yeah.
Uh,
I was going to say, when I hear asexual in the context of transition, I immediately think paraphilia, because asexuality, for people listening, refers to people who experience physical and romantic attraction, but not sexual attraction. So they'll feel attracted to other people, but they won't have a desire to have sex with them. But when it comes to transition, to me, it speaks to this idea that the individual is probably still interested in sex, but because the target is not a person, they consider themselves to be sexual. So they become aroused and they masturbate with women's clothing or objects, or say certain textures of fabric like leather or rubber. But because it's not a person, they think, well, I'm asexual because I'm not sexually interested in people. But it's not quite the definition of asexuality. So that's why when I hear parents saying that, my child says he's asexual, and he's talking about wanting to become a woman, what is the overlapping thing there? So I think it does speak to the cross-dressing that you're talking about.
well, I think that's right. And I think that's a term that people who are unsure of what's going on in their head can easily use to get you to stop up talking about it. Because they haven't had any experience that has worked. And one of the things that I've seen happen in some young men, where they initially couldn't accept the fact that they might be gay, and got into the gender dysphoria route because they thought that was a less weird kind of route to be in. Some of them, if they find a partner who is gay, who confirms them as a male, and they can then say, okay, that's who I am. They're no longer asexual. They found a way to be sexual that's acceptable to them, and somebody who validates that for them. And one of the things that we've heard from friends who are in the gay culture is that they've lost so many of their members.
Members down.
And I honestly believe that, and when I see what happens with the detransitioners, so many of them end up deciding, well, I really am gay, and that's okay. And that's really where we would like them to get, if they can get there. But the sort of presumptive evidence or presumptive approach that the affirmative people are suggesting it closes the door on that. Saying,
well,
there's no time to even think of it.
No, I think even with paraphilias, I think it's very important, as you said, for parents, because I imagine for parents, especially if they don't know anything about sex research, if they find out that their child is sexually cross-dressing, I think for some, they probably understandably be quite bewildered and concerned and think, does this mean that my son is never going to find anyone to love or have a family of his own? I think it's important for us to be able to, just as much it is to be accepting of gay people, anyone who's different, to just say whatever it is, whoever you are, that should be accepted as much as transgender people should be accepted. And it shouldn't be, paraphilias are considered this dirty thing that no one wants to talk about. So we're going to pretend it's something else that's more socially acceptable and more trendy right now. I think it also speaks to, and I'm not saying this because I know Ray, but it speaks to his brilliance, because anytime anyone tries to shut him down or say that they debunked his ideas or his research, either they've never read it, or they're not
Yeah.
asking the right questions. Like you said, his work stands up every single time. And I definitely don't blame parents for being skeptical. I don't think they should have to be the ones sleuthing around to try and figure out, their son's
You're right.
sexuality. I think it's more,
Yeah.
it speaks more to a failure on the part of clinicians and also in terms of the political climate that we're in right now. So one other point I wanted to make in terms of if a boy says he's bisexual, because there is this trend in society right now, there's a lot of clout that comes along with saying that you're bisexual. And I say this as a straight woman, so I guess you can take what I have to say with a grain of salt. But I do see this with younger people that it's considered cool to be bisexual. But for men especially, if they say they're bisexual in the context of wanting to transition to female, speaks to autogynephilia, because usually what they're fantasizing about is having sex with men, but in the context of having the body of a woman. So being a woman having sex with men. It's not that they're actually attracted to men. So that could also be a little bit of a tip off.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think you're right about that.
Yeah, but do you, I guess in terms of parents, I'm trying to think of the types of questions that parents might have listening to this. If they're assessing a clinician, what kind of questions should they ask, or what should they be looking for to determine if that's someone that they should see or that their child should see?
Well, I think the first thing is to find out whether the clinician is familiar with high functioning autism, because if the clinician isn't comfortable with that diagnosis, then they may not ask the questions about the child's development early on that led the understanding of how their self-esteem has been affected and how they're moving into adolescence feeling that they don't fit in at all. Like many of us have not, if you haven't felt that way yourself, you wouldn't necessarily understand how this child had perceived the situation and then was reacting to puberty and adolescence and all of the social stuff that's very difficult from my perspective. I mean, if you're somebody who struggles with social understanding, adolescence is the worst place to be because it's all about who's in and who's out, and it's very hard. So that would be the first thing that I would want them to say. Does this person understand children in the autism spectrum? Do they ask enough about the developmental course? What was it like? Was there evidence of rigidity or of obsessive kinds of interests or meltdowns, difficulty regulating themselves? What often happens is that some of the kids in the autism spectrum have learning disabilities of different kinds, and often that gets seen, but the underlying other difficulty doesn't necessarily get understood well enough. So it takes somebody who's had some experience dealing with this population of kids, and there are now an increasing number of books written by people in the spectrum, high functioning people in the spectrum, where people can get a sense. I mean, and parents can get a sense of what should we be seeing now as they're going through adolescence that people didn't talk about, and they may be able to say to themselves, I want somebody who can either rule in or rule out high functioning autism. That would be my starter. And the other thing is that they know enough about kids and emotion regulation to be able to figure out, can they help this individual find ways of regulating themselves? And if there are obvious sorts of things going on that are making it difficult or more difficult for the child in the family or in the culture, other than just the turmoil of adolescence, can they address some of those things? Is a family able to get help around managing the behaviors? So those are the things you'd want them to look at. I mean, as you're very well aware, so many therapists right now are quite uncomfortable about seeing kids who think they're in the spectrum because of the reaction of the activists and the sort of automatic assumption that you're doing some kind of coercive therapy with them. And it's important that people understand that whatever a good therapist is doing is not to get rid of the transgender thing, but to help the child understand that the transgender thing is only one way of being a solution to how they're feeling. Are there other ones that are going to be as good or better long term, where you don't have to impact your body or take medications that can be dangerous? So you want a clinician who understands all of that and isn't afraid to sort of wait and go slowly and give the child opportunities. One of the things I had mentioned to some people before was that some agencies have groups for gay and lesbian kids. And sometimes having an opportunity to attend a group like that, where they see that there are gay and lesbian kids who aren't needing to transition, they may be able to find in that setting an easier way of saying, okay, maybe I don't need this solution. Maybe there's something else. So we're learning more. That the transitioner or detransitioners are teaching us more too. And for parents who are just approaching this, some of the things that the detransitioners are talking about can be very helpful in terms of, you know, how they felt somebody missed the boat with them, and what they could do. But the climate is hard, both for parents and for therapists. That's the problem.
With detransitioners, I interviewed Grace Lidinsky-Smith on my podcast. So for people listening, if they haven't listened to that, they can listen to that episode as well, because her perspective was very, very helpful. How should clinicians approach working with patients with gender dysphoria? Because as you mentioned, I know that many are terrified of the activists. The ones who are not activist therapists are terrified of activists. You know, in some states and here in Canada, they face so-called conversion therapy bans that lump non-affirmation gender therapy with therapy seeking to change sexual orientation. So as I always say, I don't support conversion therapy for sexual orientation because it doesn't work. I don't want to speak for you, Susan, but she's shaking her head.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
And especially with what we know with desistance, the fact that most kids with gender dysphoria are not going to have dysphoria by the time they reach puberty. They will outgrow it. They're more likely to grow up to be gay in adulthood. How can clinicians navigate these boundaries? And obviously, I don't want anyone losing their license or going to prison.
Yeah. Well, the things that have made me feel more comfortable were the UK court findings about not supporting the right of a teen under the age of 16 to make a decision about puberty blockers, because the puberty blockers are nearly always followed by same-sex hormones, and that is the path to surgery. So, you know, we can see what's happening when that goes on. So I think if parents can find somebody who feels the law says that we should not be using puberty blockers before the child is at least 16, when they would be seen as competent to make that decision. And increasingly, and something's going on similarly in Australia around some of these things, we're getting legal findings that support parents not being the ones who are dragging kids into all of this thing, and that kids really should not be allowed to make these kinds of decisions. One of the things that I find most troubling, though, is that in some of the places in the States where they're enacting some of these rules, they're also blaming parents and being abusive to parents, or claiming parents are abusing their kids by doing this to them. And they've had cases where kids are taken off to children's aid. I mean, this is just bass backwards. It's not helpful to anybody to blame the parents at this point. And so you want somebody who can help the parents navigate a lot of this craziness and help them find ways, know that there is some law that should slow things down so that they've got a little bit of time in here before, something else has to happen. But it's been really hard on parents. I feel badly, they're trusting therapists and,
Hmm.
and therapists are feeling stuck, and it's not a good scene.
Yeah, so the Kira Bell ruling, I believe that ruling was overturned, and then the High Court ruled then in favor of the clinic, and then Kira has now, I believe she's appealing that decision. So I do think that's that's going to set the course that we continue down on, because if clinicians are worried about, like in Canada now, where you can potentially go to prison for up to 5 years for doing your job ethically,
Yeah,
understandably, people are not going to want to take that risk. And especially because the activists are so vehement about it, they know what's going to happen if they do
yeah.
step outside of the bounds.
Well, the other thing though is that now that there's at least been this ruling, and the potential for doing harm has been clearly outlined, endocrinologists are starting to get more concerned because they're usually the ones who are prescribing the puberty blockers, and there will be cases in court suing endocrinologists for doing harm by prescribing this. This will happen, and parents need to be somewhat aware of the legal dilemma that's emerging with all of this. But the endocrinologists have begun to speak out more about the fact that the Hippocratic Oath requires that you swear you will do no harm with whatever you're doing, and when they're doing these things, they can't get away with that. So, I mean, there are things going on that I think are going to make this somewhat more straightforward, but time will tell. And I hope Kira wins her thing in the court.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think ultimately, if a child reaches puberty, they are still unhappy, their dysphoria is still very severe, and a clinician decides that's the right choice for them to go down that path, then that's their business. I think people should leave that individual and their family to that decision. But where we are right now, it's just so marred in activism. It's really impossible, I think,
Yeah,
for families to get the right information. And so they're left going on the internet and trying to figure things out for themselves, which is so unfair. Did
yeah,
you
yeah.
experience any difficulty getting your recent commentary published, or have you faced any backlash since it came out?
Not yet. So
That's good news.
yeah, that's good news. They wanted to have my personal email on the article, and I said I don't want that. Thank
No.
you. So these are just parts of the trade.
Yeah. Isn't it funny? I feel like those of us who are in these situations, there are certain things that we've just learned that you don't do or you do to protect yourself.
I know. Yeah, it's still dangerous,
Mhm.
because the activists are so insistent on being right. Like, I mean, there's no, but we're in a climate where it isn't just these activists who are behaving this way. That last article you had in the Globe about it's pervading academia,
Mhm.
and people are afraid to speak out or disagree with something that just doesn't seem to make sense, because they'll be accused of racism or this, that, or the other thing. And we're shutting down, and that isn't good for us as a culture.
No. And so for listeners, my last column for the Globe and Mail, I was talking about how self-censorship on campus is so prevalent now, and that, I mean, it's like you can't even diverge the tiniest bit from the accepted narratives, or you're basically going to be destroyed, not just in the classroom, but your career prospects are also going to be affected down the line. So Susan, I know we're coming close on time, so I want to ask, where can everyone find you? I know that you are very smart and you're not on social media. And what are you working on next?
I'm not doing very much. I was offered an opportunity to talk with some of the Irish group. They're doing some very interesting things, the D-Trans group, and I wish I had been able to be part of that. But I've reached that age where I'm really trying to cut back if I can.
So,
as well as I can.
Well deserved. I mean, your work is timeless. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come on my podcast and speak with me.
Well, thank you, Debra. Good luck with this.
As always, all content in this podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to be a substitute for therapy by a licensed clinician or medical advice from a physician.